So, Walter, thank you so much for joining us today for this interview in which we plan to discuss the cyclical nature of time and its influence on humanity. So thanks for coming to discuss about that.
My pleasure.
You've done a ton of work in this area. So you've authored a book called The Lost Star of Myth and Time. You've put together a film documentary. Oh, that's it there. A film documentary called The Great Year, and recently you've also produced a children's book, Tommy the Time Traveling Turtle, I think it's called.
That's correct.
So what first got you, what really sparked your interest in this subject?
Well, when I was a boy, I was taught that the history was a fairly linear thing, that anything that came before us must be more primitive. And yet I had read some books about pre-Dark Age civilizations and how advanced they were. And so it just didn't make sense in my head that everything was as linear as we were taught in school. And finally I came across a book maybe 30 years ago, and it's called The Holy Science by Swami Sri Yukteswar. And he was really talking about a religious topic, but he said just in passing in the introduction of this book that he gave a very good explanation for why this cycle of the ages might be real. And then when I read about this cycle, I thought, oh, that could explain why you had so many cultures that were very advanced, Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. They had a knowledge of indoor plumbing and astronomy and mathematics and sewer systems. And yet by the time of the Dark Ages, they were nomadic civilizations. They couldn't build anything. Same thing in ancient Egypt, very advanced civilization. Matter of fact, their most phenomenal structures are early in the Egyptian cycle, and yet by the time of the Dark Ages, they couldn't build an arch. And it goes on and on. In India, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, and other places, we find that they're building with uniform building products. They also have municipal type of sewer systems and things, and yet this all goes away. And so for me, I needed an explanation for this, and when I found that book called The Holy Science, it really started to put it all together. And in there was this idea that there's a cycle, and I can go into that now if you wish.
Yes, so you refer to this term called the Great Year, which is part of this cycle going from a dark age to a golden age. So can you explain a little bit more about this Great Year and what it means?
Yes, so ancient cultures around the world believed that history moves in this vast cycle of time with alternating dark and golden ages, and Plato was really the one that coined the term the Great Year to explain this cycle. But other cultures had different names for it. In India, they call it the Yuga cycle. In the Maya, they just refer to it as different suns. The Hopi refer to it as different worlds, the fourth world, fifth world, etc. And so depending on what part of the world you're in, they have a different name for it. But I do like the term the Great Year because it sort of connotates the celestial cycle to some degree. And this is kind of the cause of it. So just as we have day and night because the Earth spins on its axis, and during that 24-hour cycle, our consciousness changes dramatically. We go from subconscious state when we're sleeping to active conscious state when we're awake, and all life changes. Photosynthesis occurs during the light and doesn't when it's dark, and so life goes from a very subdued state to a very active state. And it's all because of the way the planet and life adjust to the electromagnetic spectrum of sunlight. And likewise, you have the second motion of the Earth. The Earth goes around the sun. It causes a cycle of seasons. In spring, millions of things, billions, trillions of things spring out of the ground, bloom, give their fruit, and then decay. Things will spawn in mass, migrate in mass. There's just these tremendous changes all over the Earth. All because of a simple cycle, a celestial cycle that is so common we're hardly even aware of it. And so, according to Sri Yukteswar, there is a third celestial motion. It's not just the Earth spinning. It's not just the Earth going around the sun in its annual revolution. It's the whole solar system going around another star. And much like these first two cycles, but on a much grander scale, we have this thing called the Great Year.
And how long does that last for?
It's 24,000 years. And it has a celestial observable. So you can actually mark it by the stars. So just as you can tell the Earth is spun around exactly once, 24 hours, by, seeing when the sun rises and you get back to a sunrise again. Basically, all the stars, rise in the east, set in the west, and when you get back to the same ones you started with, it's 24 hours have passed. Or you can tell you've gone around the sun completely 360 degrees when you get back to the stars in the same position, and there's roughly a different constellation overhead each month or so, the zodiacal constellations. And so likewise with precession, you get back to the actual equinox going through the same constellation, but it takes 24,000 years. Because the equinox moves very slowly through these constellations. And, right 4,000 years ago, the spring equinox was in Aries. And that basically meant the sun was in front of the constellation Aries. And a couple thousand years ago, it was in Pisces on that spring equinox. And now it's at the dawning of the age of Aquarius. That's where that term comes from. And it's because the autumnal or the vernal equinox is just about into Aries.
Interesting. And so is there evidence that ancient cultures and civilizations knew about this much bigger cycle, this precessional cycle?
Yes. Yeah, that's the amazing thing. It wasn't just the Greeks that talked about this cycle, or just the Indians, or just the Maya, or just the Hopi. But there's references just all over the world to this idea of a cycle. And frequently these references will incorporate motion of the stars in the same way we would call it the precession of the equinox. And that's what we call it nowadays. Of course, the ancient writings, they would just refer to it as movement of the heavens, or something similar. And so, it's amazing that it's almost a universal concept long before the Dark Ages, and they almost always associate it to a motion of the stars.
So you think that all these different ancient cultures that had this idea of cyclical time in their mythology and their legends, do you think that all came from their advanced ability to observe the cosmos and to measure it in some way and understand about these movements?
I think, yes, some of it was certainly observational. Astronomy is called the royal science for a very good reason, and that is, it's like the basic science, the root of many sciences, because it involves, observation and counting and numbers. I mean, many people believe that mathematics sort of stem from it. So yes, I think there's a close tie in there.
So at what point did humanity stops seeing the world as, you know, the cyclical nature of time and starts seeing it as linear? What caused this shift to happen?
You know, I think it was gradual, but if you understand this cycle of the ages and some of the finer points of it, then you understand maybe why this information was lost. And so one of those finer points is that during this cycle of the ages, not only does the world change quite dramatically, but consciousness changes. And the Greeks broke it into the Iron, Bronze, Silver, and Golden Age, and have very particular characteristics related to each of those ages. So the Iron Age is the age of man, when mankind only believes that, you know, he's a blob of flesh walking around on the earth and there's not much else to it. And then they have what they call the age of the hero. And let me just digress and say the Indians also have their names for these ages. So the iron in the Indian cycle is called Kali. The bronze is called Dwapara. The silver is called Treta. And the golden age is called the Satya Yuga, the age of enlightenment. So the Indians give us more detail than the Greeks. So they say when we move into what the Greeks called the Bronze or Hero Age, the Indians would say mankind begins to rediscover sort of the fabric behind the physical environment. He rediscovers electricity, magnetism, finer forces. Things are made out of molecules and atoms, and these are made out of electrons, protons, neutrons, etc. And that there's a much more subtle part of creation. And then, of course, beyond that is the Silver and Golden Age, which is almost superfluous to discuss because our consciousness isn't to those levels yet. So all we can go by is the myth, you know, that it was a time that mankind lived in tune with nature and perceived himself as something more than a physical being, something more than just an astral being, you know, energy and consciousness, but actually more like a god. And thus the Indians call the Greeks call the Silver Age the age of the demigods. And of course, the Golden Age is the age of the gods. So it hints at the level of consciousness in these different eras. And so relating that to your question, you know, why we sort of lose this information, we're actually losing knowledge, consciousness of these higher ages. And at first, it's still preserved in, you know, records and things like this. But when you go from a high telepathic, clairvoyant age to one where you start depending on writing, and then you go to an even lower age where you're practically destroying even all your writing, you can see how things get lost. I mean, just most of the ancient world was long destroyed by the depths of the Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm. So then is there evidence of prior golden ages? I don't know exactly when the last golden age should have been, if it was 15,000 or 20,000 years ago, but I suppose there are records going back, you know, archaeologically that far. Is there anything that's been found that suggests evidence of humans being in a previous golden age?
Well, so the last one, last Dark Age would be when sort of our sun is at the farthest point in its binary orbit from its companion, and that was about 500 AD. And sure enough, by that point, you know, not only had all the great civilizations fallen, Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, etc., but even Greece and Rome, you know, they were shuttering Plato's Academy, and the next 1,000 years or so was just pretty brutal. You know, it was the Dark Ages. Um, and so that was, just a terrible time. But not all records were destroyed, and there is some evidence, for example, in Hesiod's writings of the Golden Age, when he said it was a time of peace and plenty, and mankind lived in such harmony with the earth that it would just give of itself freely. And people lived to be very long ages. And so if you take something like that, and that people live to be very long ages, and you compare it to other cultures, you find, sure enough, that the Chinese dynastic records, they show the farther back in time you go before the Dark Ages, the rulers seem to be living longer and longer and longer periods of time. You do the same thing with the Egyptian pharaohs. The farther back you go, they're living longer and longer periods of time. You do the same thing with Bible, Old Testament. You find, Seth and Methuselah and Noah, etc. They're living for hundreds of years. And if you look at what's happened since the depth of the Dark Ages till now, I mean, heck, just the last 100 years, lifespans have increased several decades, from an average of, the 50s when I was born to, many people 80s or 90s nowadays. And so there's good evidence to suggest that these notions that lifespans increase as you're moving into higher ages, which we've been doing since the Renaissance, the rebirth of the cycle. And so you have kind of all these little evidentiary points that suggest the cycle may indeed be real.
And so what, if we're in the age of Aquarius and therefore that the consciousness should be increasing, what evidence would you say we can see of that? Because you hear a lot of people saying, oh, humanity's getting worse, the corruption, the greed and everything, and it's hard to actually see that we're getting better. Are there some identifying points you could say that would seem to suggest we're increasing in consciousness?
Right. I think the hard news media does make its living by, putting on the blood on the front page. If it bleeds, it leads is sort of the thing. But if you look at the actual statistics of world conditions, you go back 500 or 600 years, every single nation is at war with one another. There's plagues that are raging throughout the earth. Justice is the Inquisition, and just there's no democracies. There's just brutal dictators, and there's no antibiotics. Lifespans are a fraction of what they are. So yeah, I think some people love to say, "Oh, the world's getting worse," but it's not. I mean, things are rapidly progressing. It doesn't mean we have problems that we shouldn't face, because they do come along. But consciousness is generally expanding, and it's manifested in our technology, and more people are living better lives nowadays than ever before on the history of the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so do you suggest that it's the actual solar system motion that causes this change in consciousness?
Well, I think it creates an environment, and then we react to the environment. So, if we're going through winter, and we're a fairly primitive culture, then we have to react to that and, hunker down and get a bunch of food and stuff to stay warm with, and versus springtime and summer, it's much easier to live. Crops grow easier. Just everything's a little easier. And so, yes, there does seem to be something related to the cycle that changes, if you will. I like to call it the electromagnetic environment, but it's probably forces that are more subtle than that. And there's a couple of hypotheses for this. One that I point to in my article there it was some work done at UCLA by Dr. Valerie Hunt. She's a physiologist, and she found that she could put people in a Faraday cage, a lot of metal in the walls, basically. And if they remain in there too long, they get very sad, depressed, upset. It's because they're separated from the natural EM in which we live,
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, wrapped in solar energy and just the magnetic field of the Earth, and we kind of need that to feel good. And yet when you kind of reverse the field and put in a lot of positive or negative ions, then mood elevation goes up. People are just naturally happier. These things are generated, by the way, by nature, by waterfalls in the ocean and things like that. So there's a hypothesis there that as our solar system changes its point in space, it changes its point in relation to other stars, that the waves affecting the Earth sort of change the environment, and that changes consciousness to some degree. And I'm doing a terrible job of explaining it here verbally, but again, the details are in this book, Lost Star, Myth, and Time, and it's a topic we discuss at length at our annual conference on precession and ancient knowledge. And that's where we bring in scientists from around the world to look at this topic.
So the conference that you mentioned, does that present latest research in the field, scientists looking into evidence for how the precession influences us and things like that?
Yes, it does. And this year we have Dr. Robert Schock. He's a geologist out of Boston University who will be discussing Göbekli Tepe and this amazing site and some of the aspects of it and what we can learn from this ancient civilization. I mean, we're still early because we've barely broken ground there, but it just changes our paradigm of history. Also, Dean Radin will be there. He's the chief scientist for ions and noetic sciences, and he's written the book Supernormal, and really looks at what consciousness might have been like in higher ages. And Dr. Amit Goswami will also be there looking at the same thing, and I'll be speaking about some of the celestial causes of the cycle. And yeah, it's just probably the leading group looking at this cycle, trying to bring it back to the mainstream.
And so where and when is this conference for anyone who's interested in taking part and going along?
Oh, sure. You can find it at cpaconline.com. So that's CPAK, the word online.com. And CPAK stands for Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. And it'll be in California, Rancho Mirage, October 17th to 19th at the Westin Hotel.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you.
We hope to get you over for that.
Yeah, I would love to. I'd love to be there. It sounds great. And will people be reporting back after the conference as well on latest research found? And will it
Yes, they definitely will. I'll try to send you an article or two that talks more about some of the research that's going to take place there, so your readers can sort of understand it better. And then we'll definitely send you something after the conference.
That would be great. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time, Walter. I think that as humanity, we've probably really lost lost touch with our place in the cosmos. So it's quite refreshing to hear again how we fit into that bigger picture.
It's true. It's almost like an amnesia that takes place going through the Dark Ages. We not only forget who we are, but we lose all our history. And that's what's so important about remembering the great year. I think it can bring back a part of ourselves.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you again.
Okay. Namaste.